All right, Chris. So that was pretty fun. We just recorded another episode of SoCo's Most Interesting Podcast. And my favorite thing about today was the fact that both of us are wearing collars. And that never seems to actually happen when we record, right? One of us is typically in a sweatshirt or a t-shirt or something casual. Right. But today must be a fancy episode since we're both dressed up as fancy.
Must be. Although I do have a long sleeve shirt on underneath mine. So, kind of business casual. You totally threw me off. I thought you were going to say something completely different. You know what, Mark, I really learned some differences in agent responsibilities that I didn't quite understand. I'm excited for people to kind of review that and understand it, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions in the general public and even within our business. And I learned a lot today, so I'm excited for other people to see it.
Awesome. Let's get this going.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to SoCo's Most Interesting Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Chris Bongirno, and I'm here with my good friend, Mark Ditkof. Mark, how are we doing today, sir?
It's been a spectacular day, Chris. I'm dressed all fancy. I'm ready to tackle the day, and I'm ready to talk about what we're going to talk about.
You know, today's the best day that I've had today, right? Got to make it a good one.
Yeah, sure.
Mark, let's talk about something that I think is coming up a little bit more, just because in light of real estate agents being a little bit more in the news, the National Association of Realtors being in the news more. And I know that when I was a first-time home buyer, I was a little confused about some things. And I wanted to bring up with you today the differences between the roles real estate agents play in a transaction. Does that sound like something we could talk about that would be interesting?
I think that's a phenomenal topic, because I think it's something, like you said, is pertinent, and it's something that people don't know. And so let's have that conversation.
And Mark, when we talk about this, it's going to cover all of Colorado. Is that correct? Or are there local rules that would impact this?
No, Colorado is going to have kind of a standard rule of how real estate agents are allowed to act during a transaction. This will not necessarily, though, cross state lines. Most states have different versions of what we will talk about today, but not all states allow all of these or have the exact same capacity. So really, Colorado, though, this is going to be a pretty open conversation.
Who regulates and manages all of this, Mark, for the state?
There's going to be state real estate associations that the National Real Estate Association will then go down and kind of regulate all of the things all the way down to the local level. And so there's a national association. Go ahead.
And then the Department of Regulatory Agencies for the state also gets involved with that, correct?
Yep, they're all partners in how these all get mandated. That's right.
So really what we can start off with, if it works for you, is let's talk about the role of just and I don't know the technical term for it, so you correct me, is and if it's the right place to start, is a transaction broker or a transaction agent. If you could maybe talk about that in relationship to the role a regular standard agent would play and what those differences are, because honestly, I don't know how. I couldn't probably explain that to one of my customers nearly as well as you can. And that's usually what I do, is I just refer it back to the agent I'm working with or my buyers are working with, but kind of fill that out and walk us through those differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So one analogy we like to use in the industry is imagine you're playing football, right? And so on the football field, you've got all the players, right? Our players are going to be our clients, right? There's going to be offenses and defenses, buyers and sellers, right? And then to manage that game, though, you've got referees and you also have coaches, okay? And so if somebody is going to represent a transaction in a role called a transaction broker, what that means is they are basically playing the role of the referee between the buyer and the seller, right? They're not allowed to say, hey, buyer, you should do this. Hey, seller, you should do that. It's really just, hey, guys, here's the deadlines we all have to follow through. Here's some vendors that I would encourage you reach out to. Have fun with your negotiations. I'll be here to process the paperwork. That's what a transaction broker is. So they're not an agency relationship for either side of the transaction.
When does that usually happen, Mark? When does somebody run into a situation where they're going to be working with a transaction broker?
Most times that's going to occur one of two places. Sometimes there's agents that only like to work as transaction brokers because they think that limits their liability, right? That this person can't come back and say, you didn't represent me. And the agent will say, I know I didn't. I wasn't supposed to. I was a transaction broker. And so that's sometimes how we see it. Most times, though, at least for our instances, is if one real estate professional is handling both sides of a transaction, right? So maybe it is their listing and a buyer goes directly to them and says, I'd like to buy it. What that broker then will do is they'll go to their seller saying, I have a buyer. If you're okay with it, I would like to step away from being your actual fiduciary and just being a middleman to make sure everything processes smoothly. That's the time you're going to see it most often.
And you just mentioned a word that I want to focus back on, and maybe you'll talk about this when you talk about the regular broker relationship, is that fiduciary responsibility. And that is not present, just to be clear, during a transaction broker. You're still following rules and regulations and doing your job, but you don't have a fiduciary responsibility to either the buyer or the seller. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And so all real estate professionals have a list of uniform duties, and those we are responsible for at all times. And they don't just go to our buyers and sellers, but we also include them for the title company and the lenders and the inspectors and everybody that's involved in a transaction. I always break that down to real estate professionals, especially ones that are realtors, must act honestly, ethically. They can't lie for someone and they can't lie to someone, right? Those are kind of uniform duties across the board. When you get an agency relationship, that's when that fiduciary comes into play. And you have extra duties that come into play when you're actually somebody's agent and not just that referee in the middle, that transaction broker.
And that's, I'm going to guess, is when, in your football analogies, when you become the coach. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. So now it's, hey, here's our next play. Here's how we should run it to make sure that we get the best of, outcome possible. That is an agency relationship. And so we can move there. We can be a buyer's agent and a seller's agent, right? As opposed to just being that transaction broker in the middle. And when we do that, we're seeking price and terms that are acceptable to that client, right? We're not just advising them on what the price is, but saying, hey, I think you should offer less, or I think you should list here, or those kind of things. We have to not only disclose all material benefits and risks of a transaction, right? But also give our opinion towards the transaction. Hey, I know it looks like a nice house, but I really feel like this isn't a good purchase because if you're looking to sell in a couple of years, I don't think the appreciation in this neighborhood is going to be where you need it to be, right? That kind of stuff. We're allowed to say those kind of things when we're somebody's actual agent. And so that's a higher level of service. And most times in our experience, that's the level of service somebody's going to receive when working with a real estate professional in our area.
So, Mark, that the lawsuits that have come out and everybody's talking about, are buyers going to have to start paying for commissions for their agents? We're not going to get into that topic today. So we're going to kind of set that aside, but acknowledge that we could see changes in the future, and we may not see any changes. We have other podcasts relating to that. But what I do want to bring up about this is, for regardless of who's paying it, whether it's the buyer or the seller, what's the cost difference for a transaction broker versus a fiduciary broker, somebody that's got your best interest? What do those commission differences look like?
Yeah, that's actually a really cool question. So I'm not going to say any specific numbers because it's always negotiable, right? It really depends your relationship with your, in particular, real estate professional and your agent and what they're going to charge for whatever service. But I can tell you this.
And I'm talking more like traditionally and historically rather than an isolated circumstance. But the average consumer walking into a transaction, what typically are they going to expect?
Yeah. So, well, the easy answer to that is on our MLS, as a listing agent, I provide a cooperating broker's percentage that we're going to pay the real estate professional, whether it's a transaction broker or an agent, for the buyer. That is one number. So it does not matter if they are a referee or a coach for that buyer. We compensate them the same. And so most times, I think that's what you're going to find is there shouldn't typically be an extra cost to getting that legitimate agency relationship on the buyer side of the transaction. Now, on the seller side, there might be. And so that, again, is something that a seller will have to just go directly to their real estate agent or their broker and see what that looks like. A lot of times there's no cost difference. Sometimes there's a little bit of a discount. But on a buyer side, typically it's the exact same.
And so talk about just real briefly, and again, you don't have to be specific on numbers, but just kind of like philosophy of how it works. If you're a listing agent and a buyer comes to you as the listing agent through a Facebook ad or somebody that you know or something like that, and you're going to end up being the transaction broker, does that relationship does that compensation typically change? Do you have something in your agreement that says, hey, Mr. Seller or Mrs. Seller, if I find the buyer, here's what my compensation will be. If I don't find the buyer, here's what my compensation will be. Are there typically differences in that?
Yeah, so that's actually called something. It's called variable commission, and that's something that's disclosed in the MLS listing for other agents to see as to whether or not somebody's going to adjust their commission rate based on if they end up getting both sides of the deal. And so again, that's something that it really just depends who the listing agent is and how their team structure works and all those things as to whether or not that's something offered. And sometimes it even depends what the specific listing is, right? What is the price point and what is the hassles that's going to go into it? And is it worth taking a discount? And so that is not one answer there, but it's definitely an option and something that if a seller is working with an agent and that happens, maybe something that they do need to talk about. Another thing, though, since you did bring it up, though, if a buyer ever does come to us, we are incredibly open about our relationships, at least for our team. And so first thing we'll always do is go to both the buyer and the seller and just lay it out and say, here's our options, right? We say, hey, Mr. Seller, we're currently your agent. This buyer would like to use us as a transaction broker. Would you like us to do that? Potentially seller says, no, we want full representation, in which case then we need to decide, are we going to stay the seller's representation or are we going to go set them up with another agent that can then fully represent them? Same thing with the buyer that comes to us. If it's a first-time home buyer, we will rarely take that both sides of the deal because I feel like a first-time home buyer typically needs full representation because they don't know how to negotiate and they don't know what they're doing because they've never done it before. And so we typically recommend an agent for them and say, hey, this person works with first-time home buyers. They're going to serve you really well. I would recommend you talk to them about going through this process. We're going to be on the seller side of this deal. But again, it's really case by case.
And just to be clear, Mark, it would be somebody outside of your team, correct? When you're referring them for that full representation, whether it's buyer or seller, you're not, taking somebody else from your team and saying, okay, this person from our team is going to do it. You really go outside of that to really ensure they're getting that full representation. And my question is that from a legal standpoint, or you just do that because that's the right thing to do?
Yeah, so we give the buyer options, right? Again, they can work directly with me if it's my listing, right? I can set them up with somebody on our team, or we can find them somebody completely disassociated from our team. And each version of that, they get better service, not better service. I'm going to say they get more comprehensive service, right? Because technically, somebody on my team, they'd still legally have to act as a transaction broker during that because we all have access to each other's files because we're all on one team. And me as the team leader, I have access to everybody's files and we do compliance and we make sure that everything's where it's supposed to be. And so legally, that's not the case. Now, I think there's always a little bit of better disassociation when it's at least not me in particular, if it's my listing, right? Even somebody on my team can have more honest and thorough conversations, but legally can't tell them, hey, you should do this. Hey, you shouldn't do that. So you're right. If they want first-time home buyer needs really, truly full agency fiduciary representation, it's going to have to be somebody disassociated with my team.
Sounds good. And that you made that really clear, that distinction between fiduciary and non-fiduciary with that coach and that referee. Now I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball and talk about something, and I'll see if you can fit this into the football analogy. We talk about things, and I know there's a big technical term for it, and I want you to share that just so everybody knows that you know the technical term. But what we tend to reference as a buyer's agent. So talk a little bit about what that means and the document that is typically signed and what that difference is. And that's why I kind of want the legal name out there, because it really is something separate. And maybe you can explain a little bit on that and what the responsibilities of the parties are.
Yeah. So by default, if a buyer ever just walks up to me and says, "Hey, I'd like to buy a house," starting that moment, I am a transaction broker, right? I am that referee in the middle where I can't give them any legitimate negotiating advice until they've officially hired us. Because then once they've officially hired us, that's when we can start really getting into the nuts and bolts and really start negotiating on their behalf. That agreement that most people call buyer agency agreement, the legal term is called the exclusive right to sell buyers or exclusive right to buy listing contract. So there's two. There's an exclusive right to sell listing contract. That's if we want to sell a home. There's an exclusive right to buy listing contract. And that's if somebody wants to hire us as a buyer's agent. Right. And so when you get that buyer agency agreement and you go through all 8 pages of it or whatever it is, that breaks down really what that relationship looks like, what the duties of everybody involved are. Once that's signed and agreed to, that's when we can start negotiating on your behalf. And that contract is essentially, I mean, you could think of it as the contract for the football player playing on the team, right? They like have a 1-year contract that says you're on the team for this season, unless you break the contract, in which case both parties can exit the relationship. But it kind of locks everybody in together, right? The buyer, right? The football player knows that they're safe and on the squad for that year. The coach knows that they're going to have the opportunity to represent that player and make sure that they're coaching them up the way they should for that season. That's what that looks like.
And Mark, I'll be honest with you, I've never read one. I've signed one. I've signed one before, but I didn't go through and I didn't read it as thoroughly as I probably should have. But talk a little bit about what's in that. Does it specifically say what the roles are, what responsibilities are? Does it go above and beyond if you don't have that document signed? Why would that be something of importance to sign for a buyer?
Well, for a buyer, it's going to be important to sign because that's going to give their agent now the right to do all those things for the buyer, right? They're not just that referee, but now they're their coach. They can really explain to them, hey, after the inspection, we should ask for the following items to be fixed. I think we can get that done for you, right? As a referee, I'm not allowed to do that. All I can do is show them the inspection and say, hey, what do you want to ask for? Well, what do you think I should ask for? I can't tell you that because I'm a referee right now, right? As a coach, I can tell you those things. And so that's
that
the benefit
document really defines it then, right? So that document really moves that relationship from one of transaction broker then to a fiduciary responsibility. Am I understanding that correct?
That is right. And just signing the document doesn't necessarily make it that you have an agent because there's check boxes, right? I can check the box saying I'm going to be a transaction broker. So just make sure, buyers out there, that you know which one you're hiring. I personally would never buy a house with somebody that's a transaction broker unless, they're also the listing agent and I know I'm getting a good deal because I know what I'm doing, that kind of stuff. But if I'm just a typical buyer looking to buy any house out there, I'm going to go house shopping, who knows what's going to be. I don't know why I wouldn't hire an agent. I want somebody to actually represent me if they're going to get paid for it.
Right. Talk about what happens if you're in a situation, and you may not have had an experience with this, but I did have an experience with this as a lender, is that I had a customer that started out making an offer with a transaction broker. They were buying the transaction broker's listing. And there were some real differences between what the buyer was asking for and what the seller was willing to negotiate with, everything from dates to repairs. And kind of in the middle of this, everybody took a step back and they all agreed that the buyer needed their own representation and that the seller needed their own representation. So started out as a, warm and fuzzy transaction. And it wasn't contentious. It wasn't like people were mad at each other, but the dynamic certainly changed. Talk about that a little bit.
That's interesting because we as real estate agents, at least my experience, we want to be helpful. We want to give our advice and we want to coach people through the process. And so being that transaction broker is not necessarily an easy thing to do, right? Keeping our mouth shut and not telling somebody how we should do things, that's very, very difficult to do. And so that's exactly a good example as to why it's not always a good idea to go directly to the listing agent, right? Even if you think you can get a little bit off the price, maybe get a little better deal on the house, where else are we falling, right? Where are the issues going to arise? Like you said, dates and deadlines and, what comes with the property and how does it all convey and all those things. Those are still things to negotiate outside of the price. And so I'm glad to hear that they all realized that this isn't working well. We're going to go ahead and bring somebody else in on this, because then everybody can really have that coach to help them through the process. I think that's really good. If whoever that transaction broker was that came up with that, I think that was the right thing for them to do.
Yeah, it absolutely was in this situation. And I think it got the home sold. I'll be honest with you. I don't think the buyer and the seller would have ever come to an agreement that was going to be a win-win for both of them, because honestly, they didn't know how to get there. They didn't understand the process, and they didn't understand what to ask for and how to ask for it in a way that made it acceptable to the other one. Mark, what else do we need to know? And maybe we've covered it pretty comprehensively. The difference between, really, and you tell me if I'm wrong, really three different kinds of relationships here. The typical standard fiduciary relationship of a real estate agent, a transaction broker, and then taking that little added step of being a buyer's agent. Have we missed anything or anything that we need to clarify with that?
Yeah, so and there are other versions of things that, if you really get into the weeds on it, but you're right. I mean, there's an agent that's a fiduciary with the seller, there's an agent that's a fiduciary for the buyer, or there's a referee between both parties, which again, that referee doesn't mean that one side doesn't have an agent, right? I could technically be a transaction broker for a buyer and the seller still has their own agent. I just, as the buyer's agent, or as the transaction broker for the buyer, as I said earlier, some real estate professionals do that where they think it's releasing them of liability because they're not supposed to then be negotiating. I don't like that, but people do it, right? And so that's just it's a relationship that is in that contract that states how we're going to be acting moving forward. And like you said, most buyers don't read it, and so ideally that realtor explains it to them of what that situation is. Another thing you had mentioned even before we started recording was that there are titles that go into some of these types of agents that are technically unofficial titles, but it kind of represents who they are as an agent, right? And so we have listing specialists and we have buyer specialists, right? That are in our industry. And again, I don't think there's anything necessarily official about it, right? We have buyer specialists on our team.
Sure.
And they work primarily with buyers is the idea. They've seen a lot more of what it takes to get a buyer to the closing table and how to negotiate and how to find them the right house and those things. But our buyer specialists also take listings at times, right? And so that's not pigeonholing them saying you can't be on the other side of it. I'm considered a listing specialist, right? The vast majority of the business I do are listings. And that's why we have buyer specialists on the team. But, actually today we are closing with one of the buyers that I service. It's a good friend of mine, right? I wanted to work with them, and that's how I work my business. It just depends as what level of service somebody needs, and then how close I am to them as to whether or not, I want to be the one driving around, or if I want somebody on my team is better suited for them. And so,
I think too, in my experience, Mark, it's been, typically when you have those specialists, you're part of a team. And as well as I do, real estate can be a 24/7, 7 days a week business. And especially when you have a team, it's good as a team member to rely and know, hey, I'm going to be working evenings and Saturdays and Sundays, and another team member is going to be working primarily during the week and, maybe 7 to 6 or something like that. But buyer specialists tend to work evenings and weekends simply because that's when there's open houses. That's when buyers are available to take 4, 6, 8 hours and go look at homes. And sellers don't typically need that kind of like ongoing support on weekends and evenings. So it also kind of differentiates that as well within your own team. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you, I bet you there's buyers that have bought houses with our team, and at the closing table, they didn't actually know necessarily which one agent from the team was their like primary agent necessarily,
right?
Because we all work so closely together. We're all holding each other's hands. We're all covering for each other consistently. I mean, for us, really, when you hire our team, you hire the whole team. And so communication a lot of time is group texts, group emails, and everybody's on the same page moving forward through the transaction. And that's the kind of level of service we personally like to provide. And that's why, again, we have listing specialists, we have buyer specialists, but that doesn't mean that I can't take a buyer and that our buyer specialists can't take listings. It's just how we just describe ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great, Mark. I really appreciate you giving some clarification on this. I learned some additional things that I didn't know about. which is always the best kind of podcast when we get to educate each other. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about it. I feel like, at least today, and I do feel sometimes that I'm a little extra special because when I learn things, I feel like you're talking to me like you're my individual instructor. So I really appreciate the level of expertise that you bring to our podcast and the way in which you do it.
Chris, I just love talking, and you give me that opportunity. So I'm just going to keep doing it as long as you let me. So, hey, Chris, I just want to encourage everybody that's watching this, like and subscribe to this channel. Let us know if there's any topics that you want us to cover. We are open and honest and willing to kind of talk about whatever Southern Colorado wants in regards to what's an interesting topic, mostly in the real estate industry, but also outside of that, and how we can further Southern Colorado. And so, Chris, if somebody wanted to reach out to you directly, though, how would they go ahead and find you?
Mark, just search Chris Bongirno and I'll show up everywhere because as far as I know, I'm the only one. But it's also cbongirno at loandepot.com. I've got contact information in the comments. Mark, I think I goofed it up last time I spoke for you. I think I did at and then goofed it up. So you do it right. Oh. You're on all social media platforms in existence anywhere in the universe at
Onyx Home Group, Onyx with a Y, Onyx Home Group. You can also email us info@onyxhomegroup.com if that's something you wanted to do, if you have any questions or thoughts on that. So, Chris, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for the topic today.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on SoCo's Most Interesting Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Don't stop it. Don't stop it.
I'm not.
Oh, good.
I did a marker, so I knew. Okay,
nice.
You do the introduction, and then we'll. Whenever you're ready.
Are you just gonna post that part where I'm just clearing my throat and shaking my head?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna do a whole bunch of.